Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today, our guest from Warsaw is Mikolaj Boltuc. He's a project leader and manager in Boston Consulting Group, BCG, and he works intensively since years analyzing the situation in Central and Eastern Europe and particularly in Ukraine. Thank you for having joined our podcast, Mikolaj.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you for having me, and thank you for speaking with me on this very important issue.
My first question is, you have developed your company a comprehensive report on what is going on with the Ukrainian economy and what are the ways for Ukraine to recover its economy. Could you elaborate a bit more about it? What are the damages caused by the Russian full-scale invasion on Ukraine? And what are the ways to get out of this economic destruction and misery?
Of course, Sergey. So as you know, for several months, we've worked with EIB experts from the Global Directorate, the Projects Directorate, as well as BCG's local industry experts and Ukrainian ministry members on reconstruction planning. The damages done by the war were immense, and it's estimated that about 30% of Ukraine's GDP was lost during the initial strikes. It's estimated that immediate damages are somewhere around 150 billion. So that's direct damages. That coincides with both the World Bank damage estimate and our damage estimate. And then there's about a total of 400 billion in recovery needs. So as you can see, the need is immense. Now, there are positive steps that are being taken to try to fund that recovery. And those steps, you can see, for example, in the Ukrainian Recovery Conference, where right now $60 billion was pledged to the recovery of Ukraine just 2 weeks ago. Of that, over 50 billion comes from the EU. So there are positive steps taken, but as you can obviously see, the needs are immense, and they stem from reconstructing key industries, to attracting foreign direct investment, to really reshaping the business environment in Ukraine.
Well, if we look at your report, it demonstrates that different sectors have been affected differently, and of course, different regions too. Like you cannot compare the destruction of, let me say, Mariupol with the damage caused to Lviv. But what are the areas where you need to go first to start the reconstruction of Ukraine?
That's a very good question. I think what our report showed and what numerous experts have echoed is that enabler industries need to be reconstructed first to really enable and fund the further reconstruction journey. This includes electricity and power generation. Let's remember that power generation went down by more than 30% because of the war. Power consumption went down by 40%, but power and electricity production is used by the Ukrainian government as a way to stabilize its currency because Ukraine sells power abroad, and it still does. And power generation is both key for the actual rebuilding and the functioning of Ukraine, but it's also key for the Ukrainian budget and the stabilization of the hryvnia, because power is sold to Western allies as well. So that's a very key industry. And making sure that the power net is stable, making sure that power generation is online is one of the key reconstruction needs. As you can obviously tell through news reports, Russia has been heavily targeting power lines and power relay stations, and this is something that does need to be repaired. Other key industries that will be essential in rebuilding Ukraine is ensuring that SMEs are functioning, so small and medium enterprises. Those oftentimes form the basis of local communities. They provide jobs on a more local level, and they've really lacked funding throughout the entire war. Banks, even local national banks, have been quite reluctant to lend to small and medium enterprises. Many small and medium enterprises have lost employees, had to shut down. But the good news is that with a little bit of support, they can be poised for recovery. Then, of course, we have agriculture. The agricultural industry is again critical, both from the standpoint of the amount of people engaged in it. It's estimated that even 20% of all Ukrainians are somehow involved in agriculture or food processing, and logistics involved with agriculture. So it's a huge industry, a huge employer, and again, a very important industry for stabilizing the Ukrainian currency, because it's also a heavily exported industry, and a lot of agricultural goods are prepared for export. And then, of course, building materials. Transporting building materials from abroad might not be fully viable. Ukraine did have a very robust building materials industry before the war. So rebuilding that industry will enable then further reconstruction. And once you've rebuilt those enabler industries, you're able to then focus on more heavy industry, more IT technology industries that haven't been so badly damaged, but you're also able to, in general, rebuild the Ukrainian economy. And rebuilding those industries was quite tricky because some of the heavy industries, some of the power generation, some of the heavy industries, the building materials, have been in the most war-torn areas. So you have a lot of choices to make on how you're going to rebuild.
That is amazing. Like that is perspective, exactly as you imagine, like a post-war reconstruction, like first creating the backbone of the economy and then increase the economic output and the diversity of the economic development. But for these first steps you have mentioned, energy, power grid, power generation, agriculture, transport, construction materials, you still need a huge amount of investments and a high level of security. How can this be provided? There have been discussions in London about that, but I'm sure that it is not only London where it is being discussed.
So, as you rightly point, I mean, there have been discussions in London. BCG was part of those discussions. We were present at the Ukrainian Recovery Conference. And so have many other actors and players, including obviously the European Union, many countries. And so there is the security need, and that's something where I think military experts who you've interviewed can share a little bit more. But there is also a very strong need when attracting foreign direct investments for other types of guarantees. So one of the things that is stopping further investment is the lack of risk instruments. So instruments that really can sort of secure the lending risk or secure the investment risk.
Do you mean, if I may interrupt you, do you mean only insurances or also other instruments?
I also mean other instruments, risk sharing, guarantees. And here there is a huge role for international organizations like the World Bank, like EIB, like Cook in Poland, which provides these guarantees, like to some extent KfW in Germany. There's a huge role in providing risk sharing and providing funding guarantees, in providing insurance. I mean, looking at Ukraine, you obviously do have, if you're lending to private actors, you have a high NPL amount. A lot of municipalities are not able to fully fund themselves. So there is this risk angle, and I think a lot of, especially private investors, without these guarantees provided by, let's say, international institutions, will be very hesitant to invest in Ukraine. Even with a ceasefire, they do need to have that, let's say, security and financial guarantee. Other things that are stopping foreign direct investment are the greater need for transparency and standardization. And here again, I mean, there's a huge role, obviously, for the Ukrainian government, but also for international organizations who are providing aid, doing things like establishing new procurement norms, trying to support standardization. All of this was mentioned by also President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government in their national recovery plan. They did also very heavily emphasize the need for better procurement norms, and I think this is something that foreign direct investment will also benefit from. And obviously, there are other also aspects. I mean, There's always the need to work on the war on corruption. So once the main war, let's say, is won with Russia, and hopefully that's closer rather than farther. Um, Fingers crossed at least. Then there's also other aspects like transparency and corruption that need to be tackled. And the good news is, I mean, coming from Poland, I believe this can be done. Poland went through a very similar journey in the 1990s, where we again were trying to attract foreign direct investment, trying to transform the economy. And I think Poland's story is one of success, where that economic transformation was able to take place.
That is a very interesting angle that you have demonstrated. And you mentioned Poland in the 1990s, and that's exactly what I wanted to ask you, because the steps you have mentioned, the anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, transparency, like some security guarantees, etc., it reminds me a lot on the steps which Ukraine needs to undergo on the way to starting negotiation process with the EU accession. Like we expect, like last week, the report and the progress of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia have been done in Brussels at the EU Commission. We expect that end of this year, in December, it will be in October. It will be decision taken if in December negotiations start, and all these steps are there. So can we say that the reconstruction of Ukraine after this war is ended is deeply connected with this EU integration process?
Yes, I mean, it obviously is very closely linked. So once these steps are taken, the EU integration process is much easier to facilitate, as you rightly pointed out. And again, it's sort of a self, I guess, perpetuating spiral. So once you have a better economic situation, EU integration can take place. Once you're closer to EU integration, better economic recovery can take place and more foreign direct investment. So in ways they go hand in hand. And the long-term recovery goal obviously will be to facilitate both, right? To facilitate the reconstruction, then the economic recovery, and EU integration in some form.
But when we come to practical steps on this complicated way, like full with obstacles, we're talking about post-war reconstruction, but obviously the war will last for a couple of months at least, maybe until the next year, maybe it will go into the next year. What steps can be done now, like in form of financial guarantees, loans, security, like insurances, etc.? Because Ukraine needs money now to pay the loans, to provide jobs for the people who are not on front, etc. What are the practical steps that are coming into consideration?
Well, the good news is funding isn't going to start after the war. It's already started. International organizations from the World Bank to EBRD to EIB have already provided funding, have provided loans. Sometimes when those loans, for example, for reconstructing infrastructure, reconstructing logistics, could not be realized, they transferred those loans to other projects. So funding is already flowing into Ukraine. And I think that's a very important point that we emphasized in our report, and I think was emphasized during the Ukrainian Recovery Conference as well. There won't be a point where we can say, okay, we're going to start reconstruction. Reconstruction needs to take place even during the conflict, even during the war. And there are very concrete steps that are already being taken. I mean, Ukraine is being provided extremely large amounts of loans. EIB alone has provided over 3 billion in loans last year, and is planning to this year as well. So Ukraine is being provided with loans. The central government is being provided with loans. Municipal governments are being provided with loans. I mean, people in Ukraine need to live. The Ukrainian GDP has dropped, but the economy is still functioning. I mean, if you go to Kiev, Kiev is still functioning. Stores are working. People are working. Logistics has been maintained. I mean, it's amazing that during such a huge conflict with a major superpower, parts of Ukraine, most of Ukraine, in fact, are largely functioning. And it's very important for the international community to remember that the funding of the recovery or the recovery effort isn't something that is going to take place after only a peace treaty. It is taking place right now. In order for Ukraine to be stronger in the future, and in order for it to quickly end its recovery after some sort of peace, funding and other support needs to come in right now as well.
Indeed, the Ukrainian economy is functioning. Okay, everyone who goes to Ukraine, like I personally do it every like 6-8 weeks, knows that the Ukrainian trains are in most cases more punctual than the German ones. What always makes me surprised. But if we talk about like the concrete steps regarding the reconstruction and the concrete areas of the economy, like the housing, like 30%, I think, of the houses are either destroyed or damaged in Ukraine, or power grid. You mentioned it. Is the reconstruction of Ukraine, does it provide us with some sort of a chance to build Ukraine in a new, more progressive, more technology-oriented way, like in harmony with also with the EU norms of energy efficiency, of Green Deal, etc.?
This is another very important point. If you look at another report that was released by the World Wildlife Fund, they do highlight the need for a green reconstruction of Ukraine. And in a way, this effort that is being taken right now to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine and to reconstruct certain key aspects like housing, like logistics, like public infrastructure, is being done by most institutions with EU norms in mind, with green transformations in mind. So we're really reconstructing for the future. It would be a mistake to try to rebuild everything in the exact same way, right? And the Ukrainian government is quite forward thinking and also seeing that. Obviously, there are short-term needs. I mean, obviously, people need housing quickly, right? So in a way, you have sort of a three-pronged reconstruction. You have the immediate short-term needs that need to be fulfilled. And here we're even talking about, temporary housing. We're talking about homes that are really mobile homes, not meant to last for more than a year, 2 years, right? You have patching up of roads and just very quick, immediate reconstruction so that the country can continue functioning during the conflict. Then you have more long-term, future-thinking reconstruction, which is already green, which is already being financed to be sort of future-proof. And then you have the third wave, which is still being planned and yet to come, which is really reconstructing the whole of Ukraine to be aligned with the EU and to be able to, and to prepare Ukraine fully for EU accession. So I think it's really important to keep those three in mind and to remember that they're not going to be taking place sequentially, but that they are taking place simultaneously, essentially, right? So sometimes when you're reconstructing, let's say, buildings, government buildings or infrastructure, you need to be having that future vision in mind.
Is there any danger that the first step is temporarily housing or temporary roads you mentioned, with the planned lifespan of like 1-2 years, that they will effectively stay for decades? We know this case from the post-war Soviet Union. Of course, Ukraine is not the post-war Soviet Union; it's a democratic country, not an authoritarian, totalitarian empire as the USSR used to be. But anyway, like there has been a attempt to build this temporary housing for 1-2 years, and we know some of them stay until now, like 80 years after the war. Is that not that danger?
Yes. I mean, that's a very strong danger, and a very strong temptation will be to classify everything as a short-term need. So that's why it's extremely important, for example, for governmental ministries and also for international organizations to engage in very smart project planning, to engage in good technical assistance in order to really differentiate, the small amount of temporary reconstruction that we need And there were some estimates that maybe 10%, maybe 5% of reconstruction is this short-term temporary reconstruction. But the rest of the reconstruction effort, which is huge, of those 400 billion, will need to be long-term reconstruction. And it's quite important not to fall for that temptation. So again, I think here, there's a huge role for international companies and for the governmental ministries to really focus on project planning, technical assistance, strategy support, and standardization. Go ahead.
What should be like the framework of that reconstruction? Do we need to create some sort of intergovernmental agency, of course, with a strong share of the Ukrainian government, but still with international bodies on board who will like run this Ukraine reconstruction fund? Like what sort of participation from the grassroots, from the city municipalities, from the local communities should be in this reconstruction fund? Like who will govern this money?
This is something that is still being obviously discussed. I think it's very clear from most organizations' perspective and also from the BCG perspective that Ukraine needs to be the one leading the effort, right? This is something that needs to be owned by Ukraine. The main decisions need to be done by the Ukrainian government, and Ukraine will need to lead the effort. But there is a very key role for international organizations in this Ukrainian recovery initiative, in this Ukrainian recovery fund. And especially using, let's say, key know-how from abroad for technical assistance, for project planning, will be critical, essentially, because there's a very real danger that Ukraine will receive significantly less than it needs. I mean, the needs are huge. Like I said, estimates vary, but are around 400 billion USD. The recent Ukrainian Recovery Conference pledged 60 billion, but you can obviously see the gap. There have been other reconstruction efforts. So maybe 150, 200 billion will be provided, but there might still be a gap. Hopefully that gap will, diminish over time, but Ukraine might receive less than it needs. So again, you need smart allocation. But then another danger is that it might receive more than it can handle, which means that Ukrainian infrastructure, Ukrainian project planning, governmental ministries aren't really set up to handle a gigantic, massive reconstruction effort alone. I mean, the need for engineering assistance, for technical assistance is huge. So in order not to fall into that trap that you're receiving less than you really need for full reconstruction, but more than you can handle, I think the role of international organizations will be critical. And also both private international organizations, IFIs, and ally governments.
That is actually, you have stolen my next question, because what I wanted to ask you is what is the role of the private companies? Because you cannot handle that amount of money and that amount of planning only with state or interstate agencies. You need people who invest their own money, who risk their money, who get, yes, some assistance, but who know what they're doing because they are interested in increasing their economic output.
And this is a very key point that I was just hinting at. Absorption capacity, and there are several types of absorption capacities for that funding, for the reconstruction effort, will be a key bottleneck. There's going to be on one side technical absorption capacity, so the ability to really build simultaneously in so many places, the need for engineers, the need for technical assistance, the need for building materials, the need for logistics. That sort of runs into planning absorption capacity. So just the need for a huge amount of project planners, the need for a huge amount of logisticians. And then there will also be financial absorption capacity, which shouldn't also be underestimated. I mean, how much of this recovery can be funded by Ukrainian debt? How much of this can be funded by grants? What will be sort of the debt ceilings that the international community will feel comfortable with for the Ukrainian municipalities, for the Ukrainian government? And how much of this should be shifted to grants, maybe? So I think those are very important questions that Ukraine won't be able to solve alone. And like you hinted, I mean, the private sector and attracting the private sector will really be critical, especially for technical assistance needs and for private lending. There's a huge amount of Ukrainian small and medium enterprises that need financial support, that need investment support. And if you look at our report and you look at the banking situation in Ukraine, you can see that banks are quite liquid, but they've essentially stopped lending. So banks really do need, especially the foreign controlled banks, some incentives or some support, maybe some guarantees, private sector guarantees, also public sector guarantees, to reinitiate lending. And they need to feel comfortable to reinitiate lending. And I think there's a huge role for both the private and public sector to make that happen. You know, private to private lending. So B2B, private to private lending is critical. Allowing, again, the mortgage situation in Ukraine to be slightly more normalized and to have new mortgage regulation to enable, you know, private owners to try to buy homes is going to be critical. And then enabling, you know, large project planning companies as well as technical assistance providers to enter Ukraine. And they will obviously have a role also to play in the reconstruction effort, especially since it's a huge, large-scale reconstruction effort.
Yeah, that is exactly what many Ukrainians are afraid of now when they say, well, if the huge reconstruction money comes, then only the big companies, national-wide companies will win, or the foreign companies, which are always welcome in Ukraine. But if they will have an unofficial, stronger position compared to the Ukrainian businesses, small, medium enterprise in Ukraine, and a foreign like German company or French company or Polish company gets easy access to reconstruction credit than, let me say, a small company somewhere in Donetsk Oblast or in Kherson Oblast, then the balance between the foreign companies and local companies in Ukraine will be shifted, not to advantage of the local businesses. How can the problem be solved? Only through this support for Ukrainian banks, as you mentioned, to encourage them to provide credits for the local companies, or should the local companies in Ukraine be also allowed to get to receive direct loans from these recovery funds?
And I mean, this is a point that I've been emphasizing. I think the role of small and medium enterprises in Ukraine will be immense. Providing guarantees for loans to small and medium enterprises is key. Allowing bilateral contracts for, let's say, more medium enterprises to Ukrainian medium enterprises to access recovery funds is also key. And there are organizations that are quite skilled, international IFIs, in providing bilateral funding and bilateral assistance to SMEs, to small and medium enterprises. I think there's also a regulatory angle. So giving small and medium enterprises in Ukraine, local companies, various regulatory assistance. And then really encouraging, again, foreign direct investment to partner with Ukrainian enterprises, with medium enterprises, and even to some extent with small enterprises, will also be critical to really robustly reconstruct Ukraine, right? Because you don't want a situation where there's buyouts or where there's oligarchization of the country.
What can we do to finance Ukraine better, or to finance Ukrainian recovery better using the Russian confiscated money? Is it possible, or we are talking now about some 300 something million euro which have been confiscated, which is actually not that much. It is maybe for a couple of months of recovery, but obviously there are more assets. Is this money should be taken into consideration as one of the sources for financing, or should we just forget it because it's what we all wished, but it's not technically possible?
I mean, I think here a lot depends on the outcome and the resolution of the conflict. The US is much more bold about using confiscated assets or in some ways even forcing, the aggressor, Russia in this case, to really pay for a large portion of the reconstruction. And again, I think this will largely depend on the outcome of the conflict. And I'm quite optimistic that at least a portion of the reconstruction, maybe even a small portion, maybe a large portion, can be funded from some of these, let's say, sanctions or from some of these confiscated assets. But at the end of the day, there will be a need for just more, let's say, regular or more standard reconstruction through IFI lending and through grants.
If we look at the future, like of the Ukrainian reconstruction before the war ends and after the war ends, what would be for you the first sign that the Ukrainian economy has started its recovery?
So I think one of the key signs will be the, let's say, reversing of the huge brain drain that has taken place on Ukraine. If you look at the amount of refugees, over 2 million refugees are in Poland alone. About anywhere from 3 to 6 million people have left Ukraine for Europe. A lot of those people, it's difficult to count because a lot of those people return for short periods for holidays and then come back. But a lot of the people who have left are Ukraine's best and brightest. And I think once you start seeing the reversal of people either coming into Ukraine or starting to start businesses, even if they live abroad or function abroad, starting to start businesses in Ukraine and putting their capital, putting their assets into Ukraine again, then I think that's a very positive sign. And it's something that we've seen. I mean, even if you look at the first wave of, let's say, refugees, a lot of those people have started coming back, especially the more peaceful areas. So I think the situation is very difficult, but it's not dire. And once reconstruction starts picking up, you will start seeing that brain drain reversed. So I think that's one key sign that we should all look out for. Another key sign that is already taking place is regulatory changes that will facilitate reconstruction, that will facilitate transparency and standardization. And once more and more of those changes are online, it enables essentially an avalanche of reconstruction efforts.
Well, that is an inspiring perspective. People who are returning to Ukraine back to build their homes and their country, which has been damaged and partly destroyed by the brutal Russian invasion. That is the future we foresee. We wish the reconstruction and recovery of Ukraine with the help of the international community and with smart plans involving investments of both private and state organizations. It was an interview with Mikolaj Boltuc, who is a project leader and manager at Boston Consulting Group, BCG, from Warsaw. Thank you for this interview. Don't forget to like, to subscribe, to share this interview. And if you have comments, leave them in the commentary section. Thank you, Mikolaj, for this interview.
Thank you, Sergey.